Claire jolted awake, her heart pounding in a frantic rhythm. The room was shrouded in darkness, but she knew something was different. The skin on her arm felt like it was burning, as if it had been marked by something invisible. Her eyes adjusted to the dim light, and trembling, she switched on the bedside lamp. That's when she saw it. There, on her right forearm, was a tattoo that hadn't been there the night before. The design was intricate, made up of lines forming a perfect geometric pattern. In the center was something that resembled a mix of numbers and letters she couldn't decipher. She rubbed her skin hard, but the mark wouldn't fade. Her stomach churned as a single question echoed in her mind: how had it gotten there? The clock read 3:23 a.m. Claire got out of bed, grabbed her phone, and snapped a picture of the tattoo. Feverishly, she searched online for anything similar to what she was seeing, but the images and results provided no comfort. Hours earlier, she had been at her lab reviewing data from an important project, but she couldn't remember going home, let alone lying down to sleep. Her gaze fell on the numbers in the center of the mark. She decided to try something else. Opening the map app on her phone, she typed in the sequence. The app processed for a few seconds and, to her shock, displayed a specific location in a remote part of the city. It was an abandoned factory, long since decommissioned. Her heart skipped a beat. Claire tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was an elaborate prank, some cruel joke, but how would someone have managed to access her body to leave that tattoo? What unsettled her most was the silence. No memory surfaced to fill the gaps about what could have happened. She threw on a jacket, grabbed her car keys, and left. The night was cold and damp, a faint mist covering the deserted streets. The drive to the location took about 20 minutes, but every mile felt like it dragged on forever. The factory loomed against the night sky, its shattered windows reflecting fragments of moonlight. Stepping out of the car, Claire hesitated. The wind whistled through the corroded metal structures, creating sounds that resembled whispers. The urge to turn back was strong, but something inside her insisted she needed to understand what this meant. Moving cautiously, she crossed the rusted gate and made her way toward the main entrance. Inside, the factory was a collage of abandonment. Rust-stained forgotten machinery, and the floor was littered with debris and shards of glass. Claire turned on her phone's flashlight, illuminating the path ahead. The coordinates pointed to a specific area in the back of the building. Every step echoed in the emptiness, amplifying the sound of her boots against the concrete. When she reached the precise spot, she found something that didn't belong. A small metallic box sat atop an old table. She hesitated before approaching it, studying the object. It was strange, almost futuristic, adorned with symbols faintly resembling those of her tattoo. The air felt heavier. With trembling hands, she opened the box. Inside, she found a small envelope and an object that looked like a chip. The envelope contained only a brief message: "You've been chosen. The next step is in your hands." A chill ran down Claire's spine. None of this made sense, but the chip seemed to hold something important. Despite her instincts screaming to drop everything and leave, something inside her told her this discovery was just the beginning. She held the chip, trying to figure out what to do. That's when she heard a noise behind her. Whipping around, she saw nothing. Her breathing quickened as her eyes scanned every corner of the space. Then, a detail made her blood run cold. On the floor, near the door, was a fresh footprint in the dust. Claire was certain she'd been alone when she entered, or at least, she thought she had been. The feeling of being watched wrapped around her like a shadow. She pocketed the chip and the envelope, turned off her flashlight, and began to step slowly backward. The sound of footsteps echoed again, but this time, they weren't hers. Claire rushed out of the factory, her pace quickening as she tried to stifle the panic bubbling inside her. The cold night air stung her face as she crossed the rusted gate and headed for her car. The stillness outside was unsettling, but the echo of footsteps she'd heard inside the factory still rang in her ears. Someone had been there. Inside the car, she locked the doors and sat motionless for a moment, her thoughts racing. The metallic box, the note, the chip, it all felt like pieces of a game she hadn't agreed to play. Her fingers clenched the steering wheel as she glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a figure lurking in the shadows. But there was nothing. Turning the key, she started the engine and drove away. The phone on the passenger seat vibrated, startling her. She picked it up hesitantly and read the message from an unknown number. "You opened the box. Now you know too much." Her stomach twisted as she dropped the phone back onto the seat. Without thinking, she pressed harder on the accelerator. The street seemed darker, every shadow a possible threat. By the time she pulled into her garage, the silence of her empty house was deafening. Claire bolted the doors, drew the curtains, and checked each room. Only when she was certain she was alone did she retrieve the chip and the note from her pocket. Sitting at the kitchen table, she examined the objects as if they held the answers to everything. The chip was small, its surface strange and almost organic, as though it wasn't entirely man-made. Her curiosity overpowered her caution. She connected the chip to her laptop, half expecting nothing to happen. Instead, a series of codes filled the screen, lines of text that looked like a blend of programming and gibberish. Among the scrambled characters, one word stood out: evidence. She clicked on the file, and a video began to play. The dimly lit scene showed a man sitting in a chair, his body marked by tattoos similar to the one on her arm. He looked agitated, sweat dripping down his face as he mumbled under his breath. "They can't know. They can't know," the man repeated, his voice trembling. "The marks aren't just coordinates. They..." The video abruptly cut off as the sound of footsteps interrupted him. The man's eyes darted to the door, and then the screen went black. Claire leaned back in her chair, her heart pounding. What was he trying to say? And who were they? Her thoughts spiraled until her laptop screen flickered, pulling her back to the present. A new message appeared. "You're being watched." Her pulse quickened. She slammed the laptop shut and stood up, pacing the kitchen. Every sound in the house seemed amplified. The walls themselves felt like they were closing in, suffocating her. That night, sleep was impossible. Claire spent hours analyzing the video, playing it back frame by frame, searching for anything she might have missed. It was then she noticed a reflection in the man's eyes, faint but unmistakable. A figure stood behind the camera, wearing a patch with a symbol. The symbol was identical to the one in the center of her tattoo. Morning came, but Claire's fear hadn't subsided. She couldn't stay idle. The factory had been her first clue, but she felt sure there was more to uncover. With a deep breath, she decided to return that night, prepared for whatever might be waiting. The factory was eerily quiet, its silence broken only by the occasional groan of rusted metal. She ventured deeper than before, pushing through debris and old machinery. In a back room, hidden beneath a stack of forgotten files, Claire found something new. It was a folder labeled with the name she'd seen on the man's patch, Observers of the Infinite. Her hands trembled as she flipped through the documents. They were fragments of reports, photos, and diagrams. The contents were vague but disturbing, hinting at experiments involving people marked like her. Each page seemed to reinforce the growing certainty that she was part of something much larger and much more dangerous than she had imagined. As she read, a sound shattered the silence. Footsteps again, but this time much closer. She switched off her flashlight and ducked behind an old machine. A figure entered the room, holding a flashlight of their own. They moved methodically, scanning the area as if they were looking for something or someone. Claire held her breath, every muscle in her body tense. The figure paused, their light hovering near her hiding spot. She prayed they wouldn't come closer. After what felt like an eternity, the figure moved on. When the coast was clear, Claire crept out of the factory, clutching the folder tightly. Her instincts screamed that she wasn't just being followed, she was being hunted. Back in her car, she glanced at the documents again, her hands shaking. 2 words stood out, burned into her mind: observers of the infinite. Claire woke up to a searing pain on her skin, more intense than anything she had felt before. Even before opening her eyes, she knew something was wrong. She sat up abruptly, pushing the sleeve of her shirt up her arm. Her breath caught. The tattoos weren't just on her forearm anymore. They had spread, covering her arms and creeping up her shoulders in an intricate network of lines and symbols. They didn't just look alive, they felt alive, pulsating faintly under her skin. She ran to the bathroom mirror, frantically pulling at her shirt to examine how far they'd gone. The tattoos seemed to connect like a web, forming new, unreadable shapes. Her thoughts were interrupted by the buzzing of her phone in the bedroom. A new message from an unknown number awaited her. Time is running out. Follow the marks or face the consequences. Claire's heart pounded as the panic she had fought so hard to suppress began to bubble over. The tattoos had appeared while she was asleep, but how? Why? Her mind raced through possibilities: drugs, experiments, manipulation, but no explanation seemed to fit. The phone vibrated again. She stared at it, half dreading what would come next, but instead of a new message, she saw the previous coordinates glowing faintly on the screen. A grim determination settled over her. Whatever this was, she needed answers. Claire returned to her computer and began studying the data she'd collected. Among the files was a partially destroyed map, but one point stood out: a red circle accompanied by a code that mirrored the newest set of symbols on her tattoos. Despite the fear gnawing at her, she grabbed her keys and left. The location was even more remote than the factory, a dilapidated industrial zone on the edge of town. Weeds grew through cracks in the asphalt, and the air smelled of rust and decay. The building itself was massive, its entrance covered in graffiti and grime. As she stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted. It was colder here, and the silence carried a weight that pressed on her chest. Following the faint light of her phone, she made her way to the marked spot on the map. In the center of the room stood another metallic box, this one larger than the one at the factory. As Claire approached, the tattoos on her arms began to glow faintly, responding to the box as if it were calling to them. The heat radiating from her skin intensified, but she forced herself to continue. With a hesitant hand, she touched the box. The lid clicked open. Inside was a digital timer and a small slip of paper. The timer displayed 3 hours, and the paper read, "Decipher the marks before time runs out." Her breath caught as she tried to steady herself. What would happen if she failed? The message didn't elaborate, but the stakes were clear. Ignoring the panic rising in her chest, Claire began photographing the tattoos on her arms and enlarging them on her phone, searching for any recognizable pattern. Minutes ticked by as she scrutinized every line and symbol. Finally, something clicked. The tattoos weren't random, they were a sequence of chemical elements. Claire's scientific training kicked in, her fingers flying over her phone as she cross-referenced the symbols with known compounds. The pieces began to fit together, forming a sequence that pointed to another location. The timer showed just over an hour remaining when Claire arrived at the next destination, an abandoned research lab. The building was eerie, its exterior cracked and weathered. Inside, she found signs of recent activity. Equipment lay scattered across desks, and the air smelled faintly of chemicals. At the center of the lab was a chair with straps, as though someone had been restrained there. On a nearby table, a collection of vials shimmered under the dim light. Claire scanned the room, but before she could investigate further, the sound of footsteps froze her in place. She extinguished her phone's light and ducked behind a metal cabinet. The footsteps grew louder, deliberate, and unhurried. A beam of light swept across the room, pausing occasionally as if searching for something or someone. The figure holding the flashlight moved closer, their silhouette barely visible through the gaps in the cabinets. Claire held her breath, her heart thundering in her ears. She knew she couldn't stay hidden for long. The figure stopped mere feet from her hiding spot, scanning the room one last time before retreating. Claire waited until the footsteps faded before slipping out of her hiding place. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. The timer displayed 15 minutes. She bolted from the lab, her pulse racing, and drove home as fast as she could. Back at her desk, she worked feverishly to connect the final pieces of the puzzle. The symbols she had deciphered revealed something horrifying: coordinates linked to human experiments. Her stomach churned as she realized each symbol matched a missing person reported in recent months. The timer hit 0. Her computer screen flickered before a new message appeared. "You failed. Prepare for the consequences." Claire barely had time to process the message on her screen before the lights in her house flickered and went out completely. The glow of her laptop, the only source of illumination, vanished as the screen powered down. Darkness enveloped her, thick and suffocating. She stood frozen, her breath shallow and rapid, ears straining for any sound that might betray the presence of someone or something else. She groped her way to the nightstand, fumbling for her phone. The faint beam of its flashlight revealed her surroundings in fractured glimpses, casting unnerving shadows on the walls. The silence felt oppressive, broken only by the soft creak of floorboards. Claire's blood ran cold. She wasn't alone. Clutching a wrench from her drawer, she moved to the doorway, her heart pounding so loudly it felt like it might give her away. She waited, but the sound didn't come closer. Slowly, she opened the door and stepped into the hallway. Her breath caught. On the wall before her, symbols identical to her tattoos glowed faintly, hovering like holograms. They shimmered in shades of blue, shifting and pulsating as if alive. The light from her phone seemed to make them flicker more intensely, drawing her in. Another vibration from her phone snapped her out of her trance. A message appeared on the screen. "It's time to understand your purpose." Claire's fingers trembled as she read the words. Her pulse quickened, but she knew there was no running from this. She returned to her desk and powered up her laptop, her movements deliberate but shaky. As the system booted, only one program appeared: Observers of the Infinite. The title sent a shiver down her spine. A part of her wanted to close the laptop and walk away, but curiosity and fear compelled her to click. A video began to play. The scene was clinical, sterile, and unsettling. People in lab coats moved briskly around a man strapped to a chair in the middle of the room. His body was covered in tattoos, similar to Claire's but far more extensive, as though they had consumed him. His head hung low, and his breathing was labored. The screen suddenly went black, replaced by a text overlay. "Project Infinite marks, Phase 3 in progress." Claire's stomach churned. The words confirmed her worst fears. She was part of an experiment, not the only one, but one of many. Rebecca's voice from the earlier night echoed in her mind, "This is bigger than just you." Claire couldn't sit still any longer. She pulled her laptop closer, searching feverishly for more information. Her hands trembled as she pieced together fragments from the program, a puzzle slowly coming into focus. The observers of the infinite weren't a myth or conspiracy, they were real, and their experiments were global. Each tattoo, each symbol, was connected to a larger network, a web of people being manipulated or eliminated. Her phone lit up again, this time displaying coordinates. The address wasn't far, and her gut told her it was critical. She had no time to hesitate. When Claire arrived at the location, it was nothing like she expected. Instead of an abandoned building, she found a modern facility, its exterior sleek and well-lit. The contrast to the derelict places she had visited earlier was striking. She parked a safe distance away and approached cautiously, her breath clouding in the cold night air. The front doors slid open automatically as she neared, as though she were expected. Inside, the environment was unnervingly pristine. The floors gleamed, and the walls were a stark, sterile white. Claire's footsteps echoed as she walked down a long corridor, unsure of where it would lead. A massive monitor on one wall suddenly lit up, displaying the same symbol from her tattoos. The sound of a man's voice followed, calm and detached. "Welcome, Claire. You've finally arrived at the next phase." She stopped in her tracks, scanning the hallway for speakers or cameras. "Who are you? What do you want from me?" she demanded, her voice trembling but resolute. The voice replied, measured and cold. "We are the observers of the infinite. You are part of an experiment that will determine the future of humanity. Each mark, each test, has prepared you for this moment." Claire clenched her fists. "And what happens if I fail?" The voice didn't hesitate. "Failure means removal. Only the resilient survive." The ground beneath her feet vibrated slightly, and a door at the end of the hall slid open, revealing a darkened room filled with pulsating lights. At the center of the room stood a massive cylinder, larger and more intricate than anything Claire had seen before. "Enter and decode the final sequence," the voice instructed. "Your survival depends on it." Claire hesitated, every instinct screaming at her to run. But deep down, she knew there was no escape. Taking a steadying breath, she stepped into the room, ready to face whatever lay ahead. Claire stood in the darkened room, her gaze fixed on the glowing cylinder at its center. The tattoos on her arms burned with an intensity that sent waves of pain through her body, as if they were alive and reacting to the machine before her. A voice echoed in her mind, cold and calculating. "Each mark is a key. Decipher the sequence, or your time ends here." A timer appeared on the wall, counting down, 6 hours. Claire's heart sank as the realization hit her. She had 6 hours to solve whatever puzzle this was, or face the consequences. She approached the cylinder cautiously, the lights pulsating in sync with the throbbing in her tattoos. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of the patterns carved into the machine. The symbols mirrored the ones on her body, but their arrangements seemed deliberately scrambled, designed to confuse her. Her phone vibrated in her pocket, breaking her focus. She pulled it out and saw another message. "Every second counts. Solve it, or vanish." Claire fought the rising panic, her breath shallow as she examined the cylinder again. She snapped pictures of the symbols on her phone, enlarging them to study the details. Her scientific instincts kicked in, pushing aside the fear as she began matching the machine's markings to her tattoos. It wasn't long before she noticed a pattern. The symbols weren't just random, they were chemical elements combined with coordinates, forming a complex map. Her mind latched onto the logic, working through each piece with precision. After an hour of deciphering, Claire connected the symbols to a new location, a research lab she hadn't seen before. The timer continued its relentless countdown as she left the facility and drove toward the coordinates. The lab was nestled in a remote industrial zone, its exterior cracked and worn by time. Claire parked outside, the air thick with the scent of rust and decay. She entered cautiously, her flashlight slicing through the darkness. Inside, the lab was a stark contrast to the abandoned exterior. High-tech equipment sat atop pristine tables, as if the place had been operational just hours ago. At the center of the room was a chair equipped with restraints eerily similar to the one she'd seen in the video. Her stomach churned at the thought of what had taken place there. As she moved further into the lab, a sound froze her in place. Footsteps echoed from the corridor behind her. Claire extinguished her flashlight and ducked behind a cabinet, her pulse racing. The footsteps grew louder, unhurried but deliberate. A faint beam of light swept across the room, pausing near her hiding spot. The figure holding the flashlight lingered for a moment, scanning the area. Claire held her breath, her hands clenched into fists. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the footsteps retreated. She waited until the lab fell silent before emerging. Her phone buzzed again, and she glanced at the screen. The timer displayed 02:00:00. Time was slipping away. Claire raced back to her car and drove home, her mind in overdrive. At her desk, she pieced together the information she'd gathered. The symbols on the cylinder, her tattoos, and the lab all pointed to one horrifying conclusion: the marks were tied to human experiments. Her eyes widened as she realized each combination of symbols corresponded to a person, a missing person. Every mark on her body seemed to be part of a record, a trace of someone who had vanished without explanation. The timer hit 15 minutes. Desperation clawed at her as she worked feverishly to decode the final pattern. Her hands trembled, her breathing ragged. When the timer hit 0, the laptop screen flickered and a message appeared. "You failed. Prepare for the consequences." The room plunged into darkness, the screen turning black as her heart pounded in her chest. The darkness in Claire's room felt suffocating, broken only by the faint glow of her phone. The words "prepare for the consequences" were etched into her mind, repeating like a broken record. Her arms burned again, the tattoos pulsating faintly, as if mocking her failure. She sat motionless, trying to catch her breath, when a sound broke through the silence, a faint hum, almost imperceptible, vibrating through the floor. She stood slowly, her eyes scanning the shadows for movement, but nothing appeared. Her laptop powered back on by itself, the screen flickering before displaying a single line of text. "There's still a chance." Claire's pulse quickened as the screen shifted to reveal a video feed. The footage showed a dimly lit room, sterile and cold, with a man strapped to a chair in the center. His body was covered in tattoos like hers, but they sprawled across his chest, neck, and face, forming a grotesque map. His eyes darted around wildly, his lips moving in a frantic whisper. A voice off-screen spoke, calm and detached. "The marks are the gateway. The strong will transcend. The weak will be erased." The man in the chair began to convulse as a machine beside him emitted a high-pitched whine. The screen abruptly cut to black, and a new message appeared. "Project Infinite Marks, Phase 3, ongoing." Claire's stomach churned. The phrase Phase 3 stuck in her mind, echoing with a sinister weight. She wasn't the first. Others had been through this, and most likely, others had failed. Determined to find answers, Claire delved deeper into the files on her laptop, her fingers trembling as she navigated through encrypted folders. After what felt like hours, she uncovered a fragment of data, a map. It showed locations marked with coordinates, each one labeled with a single word: subject. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Every marked location was tied to someone like her. Each site represented another person tested, tracked, or erased. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. Another message flashed across the screen. Go to the final location. Your truth awaits. She hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to stop, to run as far away as possible. But deep down, she knew she couldn't ignore it. This was bigger than her. If there was any chance of uncovering the truth, she had to see it through. Claire drove through the night, her grip on the steering wheel tight as the GPS guided her to the coordinates. The destination was unlike the abandoned factories and labs she'd seen before. This was a sleek, modern building, its glass exterior reflecting the moonlight dot. The entrance opened automatically as she approached, the sterile interior illuminated by soft, white lights. A strange sense of calm washed over her as she stepped inside. The air was cold, almost unnaturally so, and the walls were lined with screens displaying the same symbol etched into her tattoos. A voice crackled through hidden speakers, familiar yet distant. Welcome, Claire. This is the final step. Her fists clenched as she scanned the room for the source of the voice. Who are you? What do you want from me? The voice responded, measured and calm. We are the observers of the infinite. You have been chosen for this experiment because of your resilience. The marks are a test, a way to identify those capable of transcending human limitations. Claire's blood ran cold. And if I don't pass? There was no hesitation in the reply. Then you will no longer exist. A door at the end of the corridor slid open, revealing a large chamber bathed in dim, pulsating light. At its center stood a massive cylinder, far larger and more intricate than any she had seen before. Its surface shimmered with the same symbols as her tattoos, glowing faintly in the low light. The voice instructed. Enter and decipher the sequence. Your time is limited. Claire hesitated, her heart hammering in her chest. Every part of her screamed to turn back, to leave and never return. But she knew there was no escape. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward, ready to confront whatever lay ahead. Claire stepped into the chamber, her breath catching as the door slid shut behind her. The pulsating light from the massive cylinder illuminated the room in eerie, shifting patterns. The tattoos on her arms flared up, burning like they were alive, responding to the proximity of the machine. The voice echoed again, calm but insistent. You are connected now. Each mark is a key. Solve the sequence to unlock your purpose. Above the cylinder, a timer appeared, counting down from 15:00. Claire's pulse quickened. She approached the cylinder, its surface alive with shifting symbols that mirrored her tattoos. The symbols glowed and rearranged themselves in an ever-changing sequence, like a puzzle designed to confuse and overwhelm. Claire reached out, her fingers trembling, and touched one of the glowing marks. A burst of light shot through the room, and the tattoos on her arms seared with pain. The voice spoke again. Focus. Each step brings you closer. Claire gritted her teeth, ignoring the pain as she studied the symbols. Her scientific training kicked in, forcing her to focus despite the fear gnawing at her. The marks were familiar, chemical compounds and spatial coordinates interwoven into a complex map. She began matching the glowing symbols on the cylinder with those on her body. The first match triggered a low hum, the machine vibrating slightly as if acknowledging her progress. She pressed another symbol, then another. Each correct choice sent a pulse of light through the room. The timer ticked down mercilessly. 10 o'clock. Claire wiped sweat from her forehead, her mind racing. The sequence was growing more complex, the symbols shifting faster than she could process. Her hands hovered over the cylinder as she hesitated, unsure which mark to press next. You are close, Claire, the voice said, its tone sharper now. 2 more steps. She pressed the next symbol, and the machine began to vibrate violently. The tattoos on her arms burned brighter, the pain almost unbearable. Claire dropped to her knees, gasping for air as the voice continued. The final step is yours. Do not fail. The last sequence appeared on the cylinder, its glowing patterns blurring together as her vision swam. Then she saw it, her tattoos had rearranged themselves, forming a single cohesive symbol. You are the key, she whispered, realizing what she needed to do. Summoning every ounce of strength, Claire reached out and pressed the final symbol. The cylinder erupted in a blinding flash of light, filling the room with an overwhelming glow. The pain in her arms vanished instantly as the tattoos dissolved, fading into her skin like they had never been there. For a moment, the chamber was silent, the timer frozen at 00:01. A holographic projection emerged from the cylinder, displaying a group of people. They were marked like Claire, their bodies covered in intricate symbols. Among them was the man from the earlier video, his face pale and haunted. The voice returned, deeper and more commanding. This is the truth. The marks are not just coordinates. They are a gateway, a selection process for those who can transcend human limits. The hologram shifted, showing scenes of experiments, people like Claire solving similar puzzles, some succeeding, many failing. Each failure ended the same way, the subject simply disappeared. Claire clenched her fists. This is a game to you? She yelled. The voice remained emotionless. It is not a game. It is evolution. The words hung in the air as Claire stared at the fading hologram. Her mind raced with questions, but before she could speak, an alarm blared. The chamber shook as the light from the cylinder dimmed. Rebecca burst through the door, her face pale with fear. We have to go. Now. Claire didn't hesitate. She grabbed Rebecca's hand, and the two bolted down the corridor as the building's alarm screamed. The walls seemed to close in, the pulsating lights flickering erratically. They burst through the front doors, the cold night air hitting them like a slap. Claire glanced back at the building, its sleek exterior now flickering with failing power. Rebecca pulled her toward the car. What the hell was that? She demanded. Claire didn't answer. She stared at her arms, now free of tattoos, and then back at the building. This isn't over, she said quietly, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. The car sped down the dark, empty road, the tension inside as heavy as the night outside. Claire gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white, while Rebecca sat silently beside her, her gaze flickering between Claire and the faint glow of the dashboard. What happened in there? Rebecca finally broke the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. Claire's grip tightened. She replayed the images in her mind, the holograms, the experiments, the cold voice declaring her a part of their selection. She opened her mouth to speak but hesitated. How could she explain what she'd seen? I don't fully understand it yet, Claire said, her voice flat. But whatever it is, it's not over. Her phone buzzed on the seat beside her. Rebecca grabbed it, holding it up so they could both see the screen. A message from an unknown number blinked ominously. You survived. But surviving isn't enough. Rebecca's eyes widened. They're still watching you, she said. Claire didn't respond. She pressed harder on the gas pedal, the car eating up the miles as she tried to outpace the feeling of being watched. By the time they reached Rebecca's house, the first rays of dawn were creeping over the horizon. Claire parked and turned to Rebecca. Stay here, Claire said firmly. You'll be safe for now. Rebecca shook her head. And what about you? What if they come after you again? Claire's gaze drifted to her arms. The tattoos had vanished, but the memory of their burning presence was fresh, an unshakable reminder of what she'd been through. If they do, I'll fight, she said, her voice unwavering. Before Rebecca could argue, Claire started the car again, pulling away into the quiet streets. She drove aimlessly, her thoughts spiraling as she tried to piece together everything that had happened. As she neared the outskirts of town, something caught her eye. On the horizon, a light pulsed steadily against the early morning sky, unnatural and rhythmic. Claire slowed the car, her heart pounding. The light seemed to beckon her, each flash more insistent than the last. Her phone buzzed again, and this time the message was even shorter. Come. Claire's breath caught in her throat. Every instinct screamed at her to turn around, but she couldn't. She needed to know what was happening. Taking a deep breath, she followed the light, each mile pulling her further into the unknown. The light led her to an open field. At its center stood a metallic monolith, smooth and featureless, except for the faint glow that pulsed from its surface. She stepped out of the car, the chill of the air biting against her skin. As she approached, the tattoos on her arms reappeared, glowing faintly, as if awakened by the monolith's presence. Claire stopped a few feet away, her pulse racing. The monolith's glow intensified, and a deep, resonant hum filled the air. Her phone vibrated one last time, and a single word flashed across the screen. Welcome. The monolith's light engulfed her, and the world dissolved into a brilliant white void.